I promised that I would tell you about 2 of the missions that I went on during my time in Fear Inc., and that's a promise that I intend to keep. The second mission was literally the polar opposite of the first one. It took place in Grozny, Chechnya during the height of the winter, and thus it was a bitterly cold experience. On one day, the temperature actually dipped down to 15 degrees below zero, and unlike on North Sentinel Island, which was sparsely populated, in Grozny there were people all over the place. Civilians trying to flee, Russian troops and Chechen paramilitaries who to everyone's surprise actually ended up slaughtering the Russian invaders. The Battle of Grozny had been described as hell on earth by the soldiers who were there, and I think it's a very fitting description. In the 7 days that I was there, more than 10,000 people lost their lives, including several thousand Russian soldiers on New Year's Eve alone. The Grozny assignment also stands out in my memory given that it was at the early stages of my career with Fear Inc. It was also among the ones that I was feeling very apprehensive about before starting on it. We had flown into Tbilisi, Georgia on the 28th of December 1994, and the plan was for me to slip across the border to Russia, and from there make my way up to Grozny a couple of 100 miles further northeast. The corporation had, through its extensive resources, learned of the Russians' plan to invade, and they were keen to have an employee on the ground when it happened. After arriving in Tbilisi, we made our way to a tiny village called Soto on the Georgian military highway, about 70 miles north of the Georgian capital, way up in the Caucasus Mountains. Because of the steep terrain, this was the only point where we could slip across the border into Russia. As we drove into the village late in the afternoon, I gazed over at Dirk and I shook my head. If we stop here, we'll stand out like elephants in Piccadilly Circus. Half of the people here are probably Russian spies, and you can bet your arse that they'll report our presence to their superiors. We're not stopping here, Dirk said. We're going to drive through the village and meet up with our contact a few miles further on. When we get there, you'll jump straight into the back of his truck and hide in a secret compartment. Dirk gave me an appraising look and placed a hand on my shoulder. Listen, Mike, crossing the border will be a breeze compared to the rest of the mission. It's late in the evening. I'm guessing that the border guards are pissed out of their brains by now. Our contact will slip them a few packs of cigarettes, and they'll wave the truck through like it was Yetzlin himself driving it. I nodded, but I wasn't feeling nearly as confident. If they decided to do a thorough search, the mission would be over before it had even started, and I would most likely spend time in a Russian prison. Not a very tempting prospect. By the time we met up with the truck, it was already dark. I quickly opened the door to the Jeep we were sitting in, and threw my backpack in the back of the truck and I followed after it. I could hear Alexei, the driver, and Dirk talk together for a few minutes, before the Jeep turned around and disappeared. A few moments later, the truck started moving, and I was on my way towards the border, ready to be smuggled across. The crossing was surprisingly easy, and looking back on it now, I suspect that the border guards had been bribed. None of them bothered to inspect the vehicle, and after a couple of minutes, we were moving again. The secret compartment that I was hiding inside, a fake wall measuring 2 by 6 feet, was just big enough for me to lay flat on my back. It was uncomfortable, but I stayed there for the rest of the journey that ended in Nestorovskaya, just before the Chechen border, 3 hours later. We're here, Alexei said. He had parked the truck outside a ramshackle house on the outskirts of town. I crawled out of the fake compartment and I jumped out of the truck. I was feeling rather stiff and sore after having to endure the rough terrain. I was glad that it was all over. It was dark outside, but the snow on the ground reflected the ambient light enough for me to take in my surroundings. I could see an old car parked next to the house, and I could see Alexei pointing at it. That's the car we'll be driving to get to the boulder, he said. We'll be following one of the back roads. It shouldn't take us more than 10-15 minutes. After that, you're on your own. Good luck, my friend, because you're going to need it. The Russians are really running amok on the other side, and they're not distinguishing between civilian and military targets. He flashed me a smile. I don't know if you're crazy, brave, or ignorant. The way things are at the moment, there is no way I would cross that border. I gazed out towards the east where my final destination was located. Is the border guarded? Alexei shook his head. No, not the road that we'll be following. It's more of a path than a road, to be quite honest. I nodded and we got inside the car. And after a 20-minute ride through the forest, we were less than 50 yards away from the border. The city of Grozny was still another 35 miles away, and I would have to walk to get there. I grabbed my backpack, thanked Alexei, and got out. And then I remained where I was for another 5 minutes as I watched the car turn around and make its way back to town. Crossing into Chechnya was easy, and there weren't any Russian or Chechnyan paramilitaries waiting on the other side to apprehend me. I had walked about 100 yards south of the path before I crossed the border, and I was walking through a forest which by all appearances was deserted. I stayed in the forest for about an hour before heading northeast across the numerous fields that dotted the area. In the distance, I could see Russian troops in temporary camps. I felt exposed out in the open, but it couldn't be helped. I was determined to reach the forest on the southern outskirts of Grozny before sunset, and thus I had to press on. I walked all night and passed a few towns along the way, but didn't really see any people, just the occasional Russian camp, which I gave a wide berth. As I drew closer to Grozny, I began to hear gunfire and I could hear bombs going off, and just before the sun rose in the east, I entered the forest south of the city. It was the 29th of December 1994, 2 days before the bloodbath started. The forest covered a tiny mountain, and I made my way up to the top where I was awarded with a panoramic view of the city. I had already been given my instructions, but before I continued into the city itself, I gave Dirk a call on my satellite phone. "I'm here," I said. "I'm in the forest at the southern end, and I'm about to enter the city itself." "That's good, Mike. I want you to start moving immediately. Our sources tell us that the Russians are about to surround the place, making it impossible for anyone to get in or out. And give me another call when you're set up in the city. That's all for now. Good luck, buddy." I told him that I would, placed the phone in my backpack, and I began walking again. I should be able to make it to the city center within a couple of hours. There were people out and about in the streets, but I recognized the attention immediately. The feeling that something very bad was about to happen. Several towns and cities in the country had been attacked since the Russians invaded in early December, and I got the distinct impression that the inhabitants felt that it was their turn next. There were fighter jets flying overhead, and in the distance I could hear explosions and gunfire. There were also Chechen soldiers in the city itself firing at the planes flying overhead. I should probably tell you all a little bit about my cover, which was the only reason I was able to move around freely in the city. It was a joint decision made by myself and Dirk, and to be truthful, it really was the only cover available to me. It was also the only cover that would explain how I was running around with a camera, filming all the fighting that took place there during my stay in the city. I was pretending to be a freelance journalist for the BBC, specializing in reporting from conflict zones all over the world. Everything had been thought of, and I had all the official-looking documentation to back up the story. And the disguise worked perfectly, and it did in fact save me from being set upon by Chechen paramilitaries on numerous occasions. Even soldiers fighting in a bloody battle find the thought of their actions being eternalized on tape flattering. The first 2 nights I spent in a hotel in the city center. Most of the foreign journalists in town stayed there, but I avoided them as best as I could. There was no need to blow my cover, which would happen if I started socializing with them. I got up early and I spent the days walking around in the various neighborhoods of the city, observing the eerie feeling that permeated everything. That, however, changed on New Year's Eve. That's when all hell broke loose. The Russians rolled into the city in tanks and armored vehicles before the break of dawn. They moved in from 4 directions: northeast, northwest, southeast, and southwest. At first, they didn't encounter any resistance, but that all changed in the afternoon when Chechen paramilitary units started attacking. Their attacks were rock solid. They attacked the lead and rear vehicles simultaneously with rocket-propelled grenades, in effect creating a traffic jam. And then they took their sweet time and finished off the rest of the tanks in between, In many ways, it was like watching hunters shooting ducks in a barrel. I was up on the roof of a building about 150 yards away, filming the entire thing when the first RPG slammed into the lead tank. It pierced the relatively thin metal of the turret and exploded in a massive fireball, destroying it and the personnel inside it with ease. Holy shit, I thought. I was witnessing one of the supposedly strongest armies in the world getting their arses hammered by a bunch of guerrilla fighters. From inside buildings on the other side of the street, I could see the muzzle flashes of AK-47s ripping into the mainly Russian conscripts who were fleeing from their vehicles in panic. I could also see the very short flight of the RPGs as they buzzed through the air like giant darts and exploded on impact with a deafening boom. In nearly a half an hour, the Chechens had destroyed nearly a dozen tanks and a dozen armored vehicles. And all around there were dead Russian soldiers, splayed out on the street and on the sidewalks, their blood mixed with the gray slush on the ground. After the successful ambush was carried out, the Chechens poured out of the buildings in the surrounding areas and started moving in a southwesterly direction. I spent another 10 minutes up on the roof before I made my way down onto the street. I was still fairly shaken up by what I had witnessed, and I had no desire of ending up in a crossfire or receiving a bullet in the back of the head from one of the strangers. I could hear the gunfire coming from the direction the fighters had disappeared in, which I later found out was the railway station. They had been called over there to assist some of their comrades who had been ambushed by another group of Russian soldiers that had recently assembled there. I ran down the staircase of the old, tired-looking building, went through the door, and ran straight into a group of Chechen fighters. There were 9 of them altogether, their faces hardened and showing signs of the emotional experience that they had just gone through. In their hands were AK-47s and a couple of belt-fed machine guns. By the look of things, they were on their way towards the railway station, and when they heard me exit the building, they turned around and looked back at me. Shit, I thought, cursing myself for not having taken more care before I left the building. I stood absolutely still and I stared right back at them. A few seconds passed where absolutely nothing happened. It was kind of like a scene from an old Western movie, where the 2 gunslingers eyeballed each other, figuring out when is the right time to draw their weapons and shoot. My heart was pounding away, and I felt the blood on my head start to drain and hit the lower sections of my body. I just watched the Chechens kill at least 100 Russian conscripts, and I was very aware that they could do the same to me. As I was thinking about all of these things, one of the fighters started walking towards me, the AK-47 raised and aimed at my chest. And then he shouted something at me in Russian that I didn't understand. I did the only sensible thing that I could do given these circumstances. I raised my hands until they were at level with my eyes, and I shook my head. "I'm a journalist, don't shoot," I said in broken Russian, and then I added, "I'm working for the BBC." The guy with the AK kept on walking and stopped when he was a few yards away from me. His expression hadn't changed, and he looked quite intimidating in his woolen beanie and his dirty uniform. His eyes were boring into mine. His lips were parted slightly as he was some kind of predator assessing his prey. He had a long black beard that touched his chest, thick eyebrows that were lowered, and under no circumstances did he come across as a person that would take any bullshit. He said something else in Russian that I didn't understand, and it was impossible to tell whether he believed me or not. "I don't speak Russian, only English," I said. It was one of the handful of sentences in Russian that I learned to say before I arrived in the country. I was nervous, but I tried to remain calm. I knew that the Chechens wanted journalists to report about the war and show the rest of the world what was going on. The guy looked at me for a good 10 seconds, ostensibly trying to figure out if I looked like a foreign journalist or not. Then one of his comrades who was talking on a walkie-talkie said something, and the guy turned around. And then moments later, the group started running towards the railway station, where things had started to heat up, judging by the explosions and gunfire coming from that direction. I closed my eyes and exhaled, and felt an enormous relief. It was not the first time that I had stared death in the eyes, but it was the first time I didn't have a weapon to defend myself with. I promised myself then and there that it was not going to happen again. I reached inside my backpack and retrieved the blue vest that had press written on it at the front and back in big white letters. The vest had been placed there before I left the UK, but I had been hesitant to wear it because I didn't want to draw any unnecessary attention to myself. But these circumstances had changed, and wearing it now would probably be an advantage. I quickly put it on, placed the backpack over my shoulders, and began moving down towards the train station where the bloodbath had started to repeat itself. The Russian soldiers, who had met very little resistance up until that point, had entered the building and were mentally completely unprepared for what was about to happen next. I had made my way to the top of one of the buildings overlooking the area, and I was able to witness the entire thing. The Chechens seemed to have descended upon the area from all over the city, and the Russians were completely surrounded. Their military vehicles out front were quickly destroyed, and the soldiers were shot one by one. Towards the end of the intense firefight, I could see some of the Russians fleeing the area in panic, and I could see Chechens chasing after them. Some managed to get away, some were taken prisoners and quickly executed. I witnessed quite a few of those episodes, a quick interrogation, and then an equally thick bullet to the head. But it is what happened on the following days that earned the Battle of Grozny the description, Hell on Earth. After losing close to 1,000 soldiers and numerous tanks and military vehicles on the first day, the Russians decided that it would be a good idea to literally obliterate the entire city. And that's what they did. Their artillery bombarded the city from all sides. Some estimate that the rate of fire was close to 30 rounds a minute, and they were not talking about cherry bomb-sized explosions. The artillery rounds were packed with explosives and destroyed anything within a 60-yard radius, and it was during this time that I almost lost my life. Looking back at it, it still baffles me that I managed to get away, but somehow I did. It was just after noon, and I was walking around the area where the presidential palace was located, filming the explosions of the cells slamming into the building. I had been on the phone with Dirk, who had been instructed to focus on that area, and so that's what I did. I was on the north side of the building, about 400 yards away. I was hunched down, sitting at the corner of a building that had taken a direct hit from the Russian artillery. I just lowered my camera after having recorded about an hour of continuous explosions, when I noticed something moving on my right-hand side. Less than a second later, bullets were flying into the wall behind me, and I could hear the very distant sound of an AK-47. I immediately threw myself down on the ground and I rolled behind the corner. My heart was beating heavy, and the adrenaline kept rushing into my system. I scurried up onto my feet and with lightning speed stuck my head around the corner to see who was shooting at me. And there, about 60 yards away, I could see a Chechen wearing civilian clothing come sprinting towards me. When he saw my head, he lifted the automatic rifle again and fired a few more rounds towards the corner of the building. The bullets pried some of the render away, but I was unarmed. If it hadn't been for the fact that the guy was shooting at me, I would have stayed put and explained to him that I was just a journalist documenting the destruction of the city. But given that he was, I did the only sensible thing. I took off. The area in front of the presidential palace was open ground and thus represented a certain death. The area to the left had several buildings to hide inside. I ran as fast as I could to the corner of the building and flung myself around it and ended up in a narrow alleyway. I could see the road going past the buildings about 80 yards away. It might as well have been 400 or 500 yards, because there was no way I could reach it before my pursuer rounded the corner and sent me to Kingdom Come. I felt the desperation starting to rise as I raced down the narrow path. At tops, I would have 4 or 5 seconds left until the bullets would start to tear into my flesh. I had run for no more than 2 or 3 seconds when I saw the open door to my right, and without giving it a second thought, I flung myself through it. A tenth of a second later, another quick burst of bullets flew past in the alleyway, but I paid no attention to them. The only thing that mattered to me there and then was to find a way out. I was inside some type of warehouse. Furniture and shelves were strewn across the floor, and to my left, about 20 feet or so away, was a brick wall with a big hole in the center of it. I had no idea what was on the other side, but at that particular time, I didn't really care. The only thing that mattered was to get away from the guy with the Kalashnikov. I jumped over a shelving unit that had been torn away from the wall, and I dived through the opening. This room was bigger, but it was in a similar state as the other one, with rubbish and all kinds of trash strewn out across the floor. It was also much brighter than the other room, and when I looked up to see why, I discovered that a large section of the roof was missing, most likely as a result of a direct artillery hit. I didn't stop to think about it, but instead kept running over towards the easiest accessible escape route, a broken window a few yards away. There were noises coming from the room that I had just left, and it would only be a matter of seconds before the guy would reappear. I ran as fast as I could, and almost lost my balance while stepping on a piece of wood, but luckily I managed to stay afoot. And then I bent my knees and I threw myself headfirst through the window opening. I dampened the impact with my hands, the adrenaline numbing any pain that I might have suffered otherwise, and immediately got back up to my feet and ran back in the direction that I had come from. The corner of the building was at least 20 yards away. I pushed myself to the limit, and I felt my legs carry me over the white slush at a rapid pace. If I could make it to the corner before he spotted me, I might just stand a chance. I grimaced and I dug deep into my reserves and increased my speed some more. It was only a few feet away from me now. Please, don't let him see me, I thought as I was about to round the corner. And then a tenth of a second later, I felt my feet slip on the snow. My boots were leaving the ground, and I tried desperately to regain my balance, but it was useless. I had reached the point of no return, and I was going over. I hit the ground on my side, and as I rolled over and managed to get behind the corner, I heard the shouting from behind me, and saw the bullets fired from the AK-47, kicking up the slushy ground next to me. I wasted no time getting back up again and kept running, hoping that I could make it around the corner of the next building. I figured that I had 3, tops 4 seconds to make it, and I felt the desperation sweep over me. This was my last day on Earth. This was where I was going to die. Shot and killed by an unknown Chechen soldier in a war-ravaged country in the middle of nowhere. I squinted, and I felt the acidic taste in my mouth as I desperately raced over to the other corner. Please, let me make it. Please. I could hear the sound of an incoming artillery shell, the eerie whistling sound getting closer and closer. And in my mind, I was praying that the guy chasing me would take cover and let me slip away. The guy was about to clear the corner any second now, and if his aim was any good, he should have no problem finding his target. I tried to prepare myself mentally for what was going to happen next. The bullets slamming into my back, the pain that would follow, and the blackness when the pain disappeared. And then all of a sudden, the whistling noise stopped, and for 1/100th of a second, everything was calm. And then came the massive explosion. The ground shook like something had grabbed a hold of the earth and was shaking it like a pair of dice at a Vegas casino. Some invisible force scooped me up and propelled me forward, and then a few seconds later, threw me back down on the ground and knocked the air out of my lungs. I was lying there in the snow for a good 30 seconds, just trying to regain some control of myself. My ears were ringing and I felt like someone had just whacked me over the head with a pickup truck. Slowly, I pushed myself up with my arms and I shook my head. I didn't feel like I was hit. At least I felt no pain, other than that which had resulted from the impact with the ground after my short, airborne flight. Slowly, I managed to get back to my feet, and after a quick visual inspection to confirm that I wasn't hit, I turned around and I saw that the corner of the building that I had just escaped from was no longer there. Now there was only a big hole and flames feeding on the wood that had been inside the building. The guy who had chased me was nowhere to be seen. Holy crap, I thought as I looked back at the impact center of the latest Russian artillery shell. The Russians had achieved a direct hit on the building, and in the process, they had completely vaporized the guy that had wanted to kill me. I just couldn't believe it. I had been saved by a goddamn artillery shell. I stood there, eyes fixed on the scene, not knowing what to make of it. And then I could hear the new whistling sound of an incoming shell, and I was snapped out of my stupor. I continued running, and I was able to cover another 50 yards before a second shell landed about 100 yards away, right where I had spent the last hour filming the devastation that was being wreaked upon the presidential palace. Luck was still on my side, it seemed. I spent 4 more days in Grozny after that, documenting the shelling of the city, which literally reduced it to a giant bomb crater littered with the bare skeletons of the buildings that had once stood there. I watched Russian soldiers being hunted down by Chechen paramilitaries, and quite a few of them having their heads cut off. There were some close calls in the days that followed, but nothing as serious as the incident in front of the presidential palace. Bullets whizzing past and shells impacting areas within close proximity to me happened on a daily basis, but that is war. I had a job to do, and I carried it out in a very professional manner. And the members of Fear Inc. got what they were after, a detailed and very graphic description of what goes on in a war zone. They got to place their bets, and those that banked on me surviving making a nice little profit. They also got their adrenaline rush without having to expose themselves to any danger, while I got my $100,000 completion fee and I lived to see another day. There have been numerous missions since, and for some insane reason, I managed to fulfill them all with nothing more than a few scratches, some bruises, and 2 broken bones. Some people have asked me if I would do it all again if I was still young and fit, and I guess I would. The money was excellent, the excitement out of this world, and more importantly, I didn't hurt anyone. There has been talk about taking a concept and turning it into a reality TV show in the future, but I guess that's still a long way off. I am, however, 100% certain that it'll happen someday. As long as there are people willing to take the risks, there are people willing to pay them handsomely for doing so. In a way, it's kind of like a modern-day gladiator game. The participants enter the ring, give it their best, and those who remain standing at the end of the session are generously rewarded for their efforts. Who knows? If the concept turns out to be a popular one, maybe they'll ask me to host the show. I would certainly do it, provided they pay me the right amount. That's just the way this old world works. Money talks.